Hey folks, I'm Tom Vasel.
Jason Levine.
Today we're taking a look back at Twilight Struggle. Although this is a newer version of Twilight Struggle. This one was
the deluxe one.
Yeah, this one was printed in 2009, so I guess that's only 7 years. And they actually have an even more deluxe one coming out this year,
soon.
which I'm sad because I don't have that one. I have this one.
Kickstarter backers got it, but don't worry. Supposedly GMT is going to sell them soon on their website.
We can hope. Twilight Struggle looks like a war game, and kind of is a war game. But really what Twilight Struggle is it is an area control game that simulates the Cold War between the USSR and the United States from the end of World War II all the way up to the fall of communism in 1989, about somewhere around there. And one person is playing the Russians, the other person is playing the Yankees, and you are not fighting each other straight out. I'll show you a little bit, not a complete overview, but a little bit about how the game works. Now, we're not going to go over every rule of the game, but I want to go over enough that you can kind of have a feel for how the game works. There are a few ways in which players can win. There's a victory point tracker here, which is going to be kind of like a tug of war between the two nations. So if the United States gets 5 victory points, it would move here. Then if Russia got 6, it would move all back to here. If either side manages to get it to the 20 on theirs, they automatically win the game no matter what's going on. The game can also end after a certain number of rounds, and at that point, whoever's side it's on is the winner. There's also a DEFCON status here. DEFCON starts at peace, but could go to nuclear war. If you are the person who makes it go to nuclear war, then you will lose the game. As I mentioned, there's a certain number of turns over the course of the game, and these turns are split into early war, mid-war, and late war. And that's important because there are decks of cards. At the beginning of the game, you're using this deck. This is the early war deck. And once you get to mid-war, these cards will be added. There's another whole pile. And then late war, even more cards are added. As the game goes by, some cards are going to be taken out of the deck, but it kind of gives you a focus. Also, more cards are going to be played. There's 6 action rounds in early war. There's 7 in mid-war. And that continues on to late war. And there's different things. Also, there's a space track here. Let's talk about one of the main ways to score in this game. Here we're taking a look at Europe. There are many different regions on the board, and you're going to be trying to control those regions as the game goes by getting influence in them. Most countries start the game uncontrolled, but as the game goes by, you're going to want to control them. You'll notice in each country there's a small number in the top corner. That number is the stability number. That's how much influence you need to have in a country to control that country. So for example here, the United States player has 2 influence in Italy, which is their stability number. That means they control it. The United States has only 1 influence in Sweden, has a stability number of 4. They do not control it. Not only do you need to have that, but you need to have that much more influence than your opponent. So if the USSR player gets 1 influence in Italy, then the United States player would no longer control it. They would need to get another influence in there to control it. So they need at least 2 influence and at least 2 more than your opponent to control it. Some of the countries have purple names on them. Those are considered battleground countries, and those can be important for scoring purposes. As the game goes by, scoring cards will be played for the different regions. When a scoring card is played, each side is going to score points based on the card. So for example here, if you have presence in the region, which means you control a country in that region, you'll get 3 points. Or you might have domination, which means you have more countries than your opponent and you have more battleground countries than your opponent, in which case you get 7 points. Control means you have more countries than your opponent and you have all the battleground countries. And in Europe here, you would actually win the game when this happens. That only happens in Europe. For example, in Asia, that's 9 points. So you can't ever let Europe fall. That's another way to lose the game. You also get an extra victory point for each battleground country you control in the region, and you get an extra point for each country that's adjacent to an enemy superpower. So only the United States is going to get extra points here if they control, for example, Poland or Finland or Romania, which are all adjacent to the USSR. So this is the main way of getting points over the course of the game. There's a scoring card for each of the regions, although some of the scoring cards don't come into play until later on. Only a few of the scoring cards are in play in early war. The game revolves around this card play. Each player is going to be drawing cards each turn, and you're going to be playing most of the cards in your hand. There's a possibility to keep a card from one turn to the rest. When you're going to play a card, you're going to either use it for its operations value, which is the number in the stars, or you're going to play it for the event on it. Now, the events are going to be either for the USA, which are the ones in white, for the USSR, which are in red, or if it's a half of each, then either player can use the event. But what's interesting about this game is that if you play a card for its operations value, let's say I'm the USSR, I want to play this one, it gives me 4 operation points, then you also must play the event for your opponent. Now, you can decide whether they play the event before you do your 4 operation points or after, but they're still going to get that event into play. So you have to be cautious, because when you play a card that will help yourself possibly, you are giving the event to your opponent. Now, each of these events have some historical thing that happens. The Marshall Plan here will allow the play of NATO later on, but this will let the USA player add 1 U.S. influence in each of 7 non-USSR-controlled Western European countries. So it gets them put a lot of influence out. So when the USA player draws this card, they have to sit and go, do I want to do that? Or do I want to use the 4 operation points? If this event is played, whether the USA player or the USSR player plays it, this one is removed. That's what that underlining means. This one's removed from the game. This one is also removed from the game if it's used as an event. This underlining here means that this has something to do with this one allows play of NATO later on. And there's actually little tokens that you can put out if you want to remember which of these cards have been played. Not every card is removed from the game when played as an event, but many of them are. So what are operation points used for? Well, you can use each operation point as something different if you want. One of the more obvious things is to put an influence marker in a country. Now, when you put an influence marker in a country, it has to be adjacent to other friendly influence markers. So, for example, if I'm the USA player, I can put something here in Taiwan if I want to. So I might want to spend 2 operation points to put 2 influence in Taiwan, while the Russians might want to place 1 influence in South Korea because it's adjacent to North Korea. So it has to be adjacent to a country you already have something in, or adjacent to your superpower. So the Russians could put some influence here in Afghanistan because Afghanistan is adjacent to the USSR. Now, it costs 1 operation point to put 1 influence in a country unless your enemy controls it, in which case it costs 2 operation points. So if I was the USA player and I wanted to put some influence in North Korea, this would cost me 2 because they control it. Now, the good news is that means they wouldn't control it later on. So then if I want to add another one, that would only cost me 1 to put that one in. And so you can see there's a bit of an area control as you battle back and forth by placing these influence markers out there. You can also spend a point, an operations point, to try to do realignment. Realignment is simply going to just try to reduce the enemy's control in a country. So I might not want to put any influence in North Korea, just try to reduce the USSR's influence in that country. So I say I'm using one of my operation points to do a realignment roll. Each player is going to roll a die. So let's say the Russian player rolls a 1, the USA player rolls a 4. There are modifiers. So for each controlled country that's next to the country you're arguing over, you get +1. So let's say that the USA controlled South Korea. All right, so now they get +1, so they would be 5. You also get +1 if you're next to a superpower. So the Russian player gets +1. And you get +1 if they have more influence in your opponent. So there's no USA influence here, so the Russian gets another one. So they're +2. So it's 3 to 5. And at that point, then, the realignment happens, and you're going to remove influence equal to the difference. So 5 minus 3 is 2. So 2 influence would leave here, and there would only be 1 left. Realignment rolls don't seem very powerful, but they can be, especially if you control a country and you want to kick out someone who's trying to sneak in and get more influence than you are, or sometimes a desperation, especially since they only cost 1 operation point. Another way to reduce influence is by a coup. Now, unlike other operation points and realignment rolls, a coup takes the entire card to use. So let's say I'm the USA player and I want to use this card as a coup. First, I look at the stability number of a region where I'm trying to have the coup. That's going to be 6. The stability number there is 3. I'm going to multiply that by 2, so it's 6. Then I would roll a die. So I roll a 6 here, and I would add the number of operations on the card that I played, so 3, so that's 9. Is it greater than 6? It is. So the coup is successful. So again, you'll move influence equal to the difference. So that was 9 to 6. So 3 influence is gone. So a coup is a quick way to kind of hurt a country. And if you had done even more the difference in that, you could even get influence of your own in a country. But a coup has other results too. If a coup happens in a battleground state, then DEFCON status goes up by 1. So you have to be very careful. And as the DEFCON status goes up, you can't do coups in certain areas. Like no more coups can happen in Europe while DEFCON is at 4. Once DEFCON gets to 3, no coups in Asia. You will also get a certain number of military operations whenever you do a coup. As the game goes by, each player is trying to get a certain number of military operations each turn, because if you don't, you will give whoever does more military operations essentially will get more points than your opponent at the end of each round. Now you might feel frustrated because you have this card that's a really great event for your opponent and you want to use it for operation points, but you don't want to give them the US-Japan Mutual Defense Pact. Well, you can each turn basically discard a card to try to advance on the space racetrack. Advancing on a space racetrack will not only give you extra special abilities, if you get all the way to the end, you'll get 8 action rounds instead of 7, but it also gives you victory points. And the first person to get to each of these spots here will get more victory points than the second. So space race is used to discard cards, but also to give you special abilities. So you simply discard a card. Here you need to play at least 2 operation cards, and then you roll die. And if you get a 1 through 3, boom, you go up. If you don't move up. So there's some luck as you're trying to go up on the space race track, but at the same time, it does let you get rid of a card that might help your opponent out. So that's pretty much the concepts of the game. Each turn, players are going to get a handful of cards, and they're going to each play a card in what's called a headline phase, where you turn the cards over, and you will only do the event on that card. So you play one of your own events, usually during the headline phase. And then players will take turns going back and forth, playing actions, either for the operation or for the event, possibly giving the event to their opponent. If you have a scoring card in your hand, you must play it before the end of a turn, even if it does not help you. But you know that area is going to score. So if you know South America is going to score, you might be trying to get some influence into South America before you are forced to play the card. This will continue back and forth as players do this until one player wins through one of the victory point methods that I outlined. Now I want to start out this time with the awesomeness rating so that we can go from there.
This one, it's a 10.
Really?
It's a 10.
Wow. Now I only give my 10 favorite games a 10. So I'm going to give this one a 9, but that's pretty close for us, really.
Yeah.
Okay? Twilight Struggle is the best depiction of the Cold War ever made.
Yes.
It's also super involved and so much theme in the game, and yet at the same time, I could teach this to almost anyone. It looks more complex than it is, although the strategy in it is fairly complex.
Strategy is the most complex part of the game, and that's where you have to decide, what you're going to do, where you're going to spread, all of that. That, based on which cards you get in your hands at the beginning of the game will determine a lot. But I think strategy is the most important part of the game. But the game, the feel, the history, the cards are all historical cards and have historical flair to them. And what they did with this, which took it away from the older war games, like they had done Hannibal before this, and Hannibal had counters, and the counters had like your little stats of your attack and your defense and everything. This went to cubes, and cubes made all the difference of making it into a more Euro style version of a war game.
Well, they actually changed it to counters now and stuff in this one.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, the counters flip over and are different numbers and things.
Ah.
Yeah, it's a little bit better, actually. The game itself, I remember when it first came out, people were raving about it. There were some errors on the board. They spelled chili like the food and some other things. But they fixed that stuff. But the fascinating thing about the game is the card system in there. The fact that every card, when you play it, you can do 1, 2, 3 things with it or so. but you are probably giving something to your opponent. And that's such a tough thing. Every time I play a card in this game, I'm like, oh, I'm helping out my opponent. Oh, here we go.
But I'm doing something cooler for myself. That's the whole thing. Like, you do something cool for yourself, and okay, you're doing a little for them, but as long as you do a cool action, you really need to decide what you're going to do on each card. Now, every card is important in this game. Like, every single card play makes a difference in this game. You can't just haphazardly do things. You really need to plot out what you're going to do with each of your cards when you get your hand.
And your freedom is so great. You're like, oh, you know what? I'm going to work in Africa. No, I'm over in South America. I'm over in Europe. And you got to watch what your opponent's doing. You definitely cannot let him win Europe.
Nope.
Okay, you'll lose the game. But at the same time, if you like, I'm not going to bother with Africa, I'm not going to bother South America, you're going to get wailed on. And so you are like watching the whole world. And sometimes you have to say, all right, whatever, you have Southeast Asia. I can't do anything about that. But you can only maybe do that once in the game.
Yeah.
And then you're sitting there going, oh, I can't fall behind in the space race. You're always feeling like you're having to what the other guy's doing.
Yes. It's got a real good back and forth, and there's a good balance there when you're, I push, you push, we both are pushing for different things, but you do have to pay attention, and it does it slightly differently. Like other games that are in the same style, or other GMT collection games like Paths of Glory, you have fronts and you're pushing the fronts, but in this it's kind of, you have more freedom, but you're still doing the same kind of thing, like balancing out every area to make sure that you don't get completely overwhelmed in an area.
Now, I will say this. If you have never played this before and you play someone who has, they're going to whoop you. Okay, this game definitely is a learning curve. The first time you're playing, let's say you're playing the USSR and the communists, and you're like, I'm going to take over Japan. That's a bad idea because you don't know, but there's a card in the game that essentially just gives Japan back to the USA. So you know that card exists, so you probably aren't going to mess with Japan. At least maybe not in the beginning, because you know that card exists. And so there's a lot of cards like that throughout the game, and there's just that learning curve. And you're like, oh, I didn't realize that this country was so important, because it's like a stepping stone to all the other countries. And those battleground countries, scoring the first couple times, you're like, how does scoring work? You learn really quickly how scoring works. And there's some luck in the game. And the game is slightly tilted towards USA. Yeah. But that's okay, because if that's really bothersome, you can just both play each side and then like do a total score, or when did you win the game compared to when I won. Yeah. Although I've won the game as USSR.
So have I.
Yeah, it's not...
So have I. I mean, it's,
Although I don't think we have ever actually played each other in this game.
We haven't. He
would probably wail on me.
I don't know. Maybe.
This game is very historical. They really pumped a lot of history into this game.
And the way it goes from the early war to the mid-war to the late war, it really... things come out in stages. It's not just like, all of a sudden I built a space shuttle in turn one. Like, you kind of go through, like, history as it's happening. But you're also writing your own history, because obviously you can do anything and it's ahistorical because you're making your own history.
That's right. The Korean War did not end the way it happened in real life, thanks to me. Yeah. This, don't worry if you're like, oh, I didn't get the special edition. This version is very well done.
Yes.
This game is currently ranked number 2 on Board Game Geek. That's very high. Okay. And that's really odd for a game such as this, but I'm telling you, while this game is certainly not everyone's cup of tea, I wouldn't recommend it to I wouldn't play it with my wife. Most of my kids wouldn't be interested in it. But when you do play it, it's an immersive thing. The team who did this, Jason Matthews in particular, one of the 2 designers, he has done other games, 1960, helped with 1989, and all those games are very good. But this was lightning in a bottle. This is almost a perfect game, which is hard to say.
And he really brings his political skills into it, because he used to work for the female senator who was from Louisiana. He used to work for her.
He's very involved in politics.
So he's very involved in politics, and he really brings, like, it really feels like you're on a political thing. And I like how he brings his experience into it and makes the flavor of the game feel just like real life.
If you ever get a chance to try this one out, I highly recommend it. That's Twilight Struggle.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.